Imagine walking through Parliament Square in London. In the shadow of Big Ben, you encounter a strange, gray monolith. It's not a monument, but a plywood box, hastily erected and thoroughly uninspiring.
Right.
To a tourist who didn't know the context, it might look like construction work or perhaps a piece of brutalist modern art left to rot. But inside this wooden cage stands Winston Churchill. The man who rallied a civilization against the darkness of fascism has been boarded up like a condemned house. Why? Because in 2020, the words "is a racist" were sprayed across the stone plinth. The authorities decided the only way to deal with the statue was to imprison it for its own protection.
Its own protection? Wow.
Now cross the ocean to New York City Hall. For over a century, Thomas Jefferson stood there. But in November 2021, a group of city council members gathered in a room, took a unanimous vote, and decided he had to go. They didn't just remove a piece of bronze, they removed a founder.
And the reason was? What was the official reason?
One council member mentioned feeling deeply uncomfortable in his presence. There's a very specific energy in these moments. It isn't just political disagreement or a desire for historical accuracy. When you watch the videos of these statues coming down or see that gray box in London, you don't feel a sense of justice being restored. You feel a strange, cold smugness. It's the feeling of a generation that has built nothing, standing in judgment of those who built everything. It feels less like a history lesson and more like a psychological condition, a desperate need to kill the father just to prove you own the house.
Psychological patricide. That's a strong but I think very accurate way of framing it.
It feels like that. We're witnessing what seems to be a systematic, almost compulsive need for historical revisionism that goes far beyond just, acknowledging complexity. Our mission today is to move past the immediate political debate and do a deep dive into the sociological and philosophical implications of all this.
Yeah, to really get under the hood of what's happening.
Exactly. We need to investigate how this deliberate dismantling of national heroes and foundational stories contributes to societal fracture and the erosion of our collective identity. What happens to a society when its foundational heroes, the people who embodied its virtues, are deliberately dismantled?
Well, that dismantling, as you frame it, it creates a profound vacuum where shared values once anchored us. It's a purposeful severing of the cultural umbilical cord. Sociologically, we have a precise concept for this breakdown of communal bonds and moral guidance.
That would be?
Anomie. When the shared understanding of who we are, what standards we should follow, and what goals are legitimate just dissolves, the society starts to drift violently. That moral drift is the core crisis we need to unpack because it explains the strange fervor behind these acts of demolition.
Okay, so let's unpack this concept of anomie, or sometimes you see it as anomie. The common definition we hear is normlessness, a society without rules. But I think for anyone listening, that definition feels too thin. It just sounds like anarchy. But I get the sense Durkheim was observing something much more nuanced, maybe more insidious, when he popularized the term.
It is. It misses the profound psychological component. Anomie is defined as a social condition characterized by the uprooting or breakdown of any moral values, standards, or guidance. Durkheim, writing in the late 19th century, was dealing with the psychic shock of modernity.
Right.
And critically, he never used the term normlessness because that suggests a simple lack of rules. He described anomie as derangement and, far more chillingly, as an insatiable will.
An insatiable will. Okay, that's the key phrase we need to lock onto. What did he mean by linking a lack of social standards to an unfulfillable desire? Because that speaks directly to the compulsion to tear down historical figures without end.
He called it the malady of the infinite. So think about the function of social norms, of shared myths, of heroes. They are not merely restrictive, they are regulative. They define limits, they tell you what is achievable, what constitutes honor, what is necessary for a good life, and what goals are legitimately pursued.
They give you the boundaries of the playing field, so to speak.
Exactly. And when those limits are removed, or when the entire societal framework that validates those limits is delegitimized and dismantled, desire becomes structurally infinite. It loses its boundary condition.
And if desire is infinite, it can never by definition be fulfilled. You can't reach the horizon of infinity.
Correct. It only becomes more intense and more frustrated, which leads to a profound sense of purposelessness, anxiety, and alienation. And when we apply this to our current cultural moment, if the goal is absolute moral purity, a history entirely free of stain, sin, or compromise, that goal is infinite and unattainable.
So the cultural project of demolishing flawed heroes is doomed from the start. If they remove Jefferson because he owned slaves, the desire for purity doesn't just stop. It moves on to Churchill because he held certain views, and then maybe Lincoln because he initially favored colonization. The process of demolition itself becomes the goal.
Yes.
Because achieving that perfect, untainted history is the malady of the infinite. In action, it can never be satisfied.
Precisely. The process of critique and destruction becomes a self-perpetuating cycle of negative affirmation.
Wow.
To understand Durkheim's full context here, we have to look at where he developed the concept, which was in the Division of Labor and Society back in 1893. Anomie wasn't just, moral decay. It was a structural malfunction resulting from rapid change.
A malfunction due to the shock of industrialization, right? The sudden shift in how society organized itself.
Yes, he analyzed the shift from what he called mechanical solidarity to organic solidarity. Mechanical solidarity is what you find in simpler, often pre-industrial societies. Think of a village where everyone is either a farmer, a blacksmith, or a baker.
So everyone has similar or largely redundant skills.
Exactly. The shared consciousness, the moral and spiritual ties are incredibly strong, but the system has huge inertia. It resists change violently.
It's tightly unified, but it's inflexible.
Whereas organic solidarity emerges from a complex division of labor, like in a modern city or a specialized corporation. People do vastly different things, and that creates a mutual dependence. The system becomes very sensitive to mutual needs and highly adaptive, but the moral and emotional bonds are much thinner, much more abstract.
So industrialization required society to move toward this organic solidarity, specialization, mutual dependence. But the old mechanical moral system just had too much inertia to adapt quickly enough. This transition period is where the trouble begins.
That's it, exactly. Durkheim described the transition as one where mass regimentation, the new industrial reality, was too rigid to adapt to the specialized needs of organic life. He said anomie results when an opaque environment is interposed between the parts of society, making relations rare and intermittent.
So people feel disconnected.
Totally. If the businessman or the laborer can no longer embrace the market at a glance, as he put it, production becomes unbridled and unregulated.
That's a powerful metaphor for our current situation. The old cultural landscape, the heroes, the shared myths, the moral rules, once provided a clear, easily grasped environment. Now, that environment has become opaque. The rapid shifts in communication and moral consensus have left society unregulated, leading to this unbridled moral desire and the impulse to destroy the old limits.
And that sociological dislocation has tangible individual costs. In his famous 1897 study, Suicide, Durkheim linked anomie directly to increased suicide rates, contrasting groups with varying levels of social cohesion.
He found, for example, that Catholics had lower suicide rates than Protestants.
Correct. He attributed this to the generally higher level of social integration found in the Catholic social structure, which provided tighter moral regulation and a stronger sense of communal belonging. When the ties uniting an individual with others are slackened or broken, society is not sufficiently integrated at the points of contact.
Which is a direct result of the weakening of the social fabric.
Yes. Anomie is the social failure to regulate the appetites of its members, and that leads to despair.
That's a huge distinction. It wasn't just about individual vulnerability, but about the social disintegration that stripped individuals of their necessary moral guardrails. And this brings us to Merton's expansion of the concept. Robert K. Merton, in 1938, explicitly connected anomie with deviance.
Right. Merton formalized the idea that deviance behavior that violates social norms arises from the discontinuity between common social goals and the legitimate institutional means available to attain them.
Okay, so a simple example would be society tells you you must achieve financial success.
Right, that's the goal.
But the economy or the educational system blocks the legitimate pathways for certain groups to achieve that success. So the pressure to deviate from the norms, to commit crime, for example, increases.
Exactly. It's what he called strain theory.
So let's apply that strain theory directly to our topic. If the social goal, promoted by modern institutions and education, is absolute historical moral purity, but history itself is messy, compromised, and tainted, well, that blocks the legitimate means to achieve the goal, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The historical record itself becomes the structural block. The only way to resolve that sociological strain and achieve the feeling of purity is through a radical and often destructive act of total repudiation.
The removal of the statue, is a form of institutionalized deviance aimed at resolving that strain.
Yes, it's a shortcut to moral clarity.
It provides the immediate emotional satisfaction of having achieved a moral victory without the hard work of intellectual reckoning. It's a very clean, surgical solution to a very messy problem.
And if anomie is the malady, it's helpful to look at its direct opposite. The sociologist Frida Adler coined the term synomie.
Synomie. Never heard of it. What does it mean?
She defined it as a congruence of norms to the point of harmonious accommodation.
So a functional society.
Basically, yes. It describes a state characterized by norm conformity, strong cohesion, intact social controls, and high norm integration. It's what keeps society together and resilient. Crucially, Adler pointed out that institutions like the family, religion, and community, what we often call civil society, are the primary sources of social control that maintain a synomic society.
That definition immediately makes me ask, does this state of synomie allow for necessary change in moral progress? Or is it just another form of that societal rigidity we talked about with mechanical solidarity? The move away from that was, after all, necessary.
That's an essential distinction to make. Synomie is not about stagnation, it's about regulated change. It means the norms are accommodating, meaning they can evolve and absorb new moral knowledge without shattering the entire communal structure.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A strong local community that evolves its practices over time while maintaining a foundational respect for its history is a good example. The bonds allow for internal critique without total self-rejection.
And the crisis we're discussing is exactly the loss of that synomie. The very institutions, family, community, religion, that should be providing the standards and cohesion are either weak or they are actively participating in the dismantling of the symbol that held the norms together, creating this derangement.
That's the core of it. They're accelerating the enemy instead of preventing it.
So if anomie is the resulting sociological fracture, then the physical heroes and monuments are the fault lines. They are the visible, physical embodiment of the standards and stories that are now under attack. This shifts our focus to the intellectual battleground itself, historical memory.
Historical memory is so much more than rote learning of dates and names. It is the mental core of public consciousness. It provides the ability for the individual and for the entire society to identify itself, to answer the question, who are we and where did we come from?
So if we accept that national identity is rooted in historical memory, then its manipulation or outright destruction is a critical threat to social consolidation and even national security.
It absolutely is.
So tearing down a statue isn't just about deleting a piece of bronze. It's an attempt to delete a part of the society's collective brain. It forces a fundamental, sometimes traumatic, self-redefinition.
And this is why we have to clarify the role of monuments. We often treat them like holy relics or, complete biographical summaries, but that's not their primary purpose. The conservative writer Ross Douthat offered a really sound framework for this.
Ooh, the one about deeds.
Yes, monuments exist primarily to honor deeds, not to issue canonizations. They express gratitude for a specific, worthwhile inheritance.
It's a physical acknowledgement of a foundational debt. We're grateful for this specific thing that this person did.
Precisely. And Douthat argues that repudiating or dismantling a memorial only makes moral sense if you intend to repudiate the specific deed it memorializes. If you tear down a statue of Jefferson, you must be prepared to say, the Declaration of Independence and the ideals of universal liberty it advanced are also something we repudiate.
But that's not what people say. What we see today is a situation where people claim to love the ideals, liberty, equality, but despise the flawed individuals who first articulated them. And this is where we fall into the two traps that completely distort that measured approach you just described. The lionization trap and the demonization trap.
Let's start with the lionization trap. That's the traditional, often conservative pitfall. It transforms figures like Washington or Jefferson into objects of a civil religion, treating them with an almost untouchable religious degree of reverence.
And you see this tendency to polish away every single imperfection, right? Their monumental achievements get conflated with an impossibly venerable personal character, creating this narrative of continuous, almost preordained moral progress.
And, it was a necessary or at least a pragmatic move during certain periods. For example, during the height of the Cold War, historians often crafted narratives that emphasized ideological consensus and American exceptionalism to shore up national unity against communism. The goal was valid, emphasize achievement and virtue to build social cohesion.
Wait, I want to push back on that a little. If the goal was national self-preservation against an existential threat like the Soviet Union, is that truly a trap? Or is it just a pragmatic political necessity that we're now unfairly judging from a position of relative comfort?
That's a vital question. It was certainly pragmatic, and it served a crucial purpose in securing a kind of mechanical solidarity necessary for rapid national action. However, the trap lies in the unintended consequence, the creation of an impossibly high hagiographic standard for the founders that guarantees future failure.
Ah, okay.
By sanding down every rough edge, they cease to be complex human beings, and they become flat, infallible saints gods, not men.
And that impossible standard is what feeds the second trap. When the public inevitably discovers the very real sins, the hypocrisy, the cruelty of slave ownership, the flawed policy decisions, the counter-reaction is instantaneous and total, leading us straight into the demonization trap.
The demonization trap goes beyond just correcting flawed histories to a complete repudiation of both the character and the contributions. It rejects these figures entirely, not just for their failures, but often for the mere fact of existing in a less enlightened time.
It's not historical inquiry. It's a moral purity test conducted across centuries.
And it devolves into a punitive exercise driven by what critics call self-centered moralism. The complexity of history is flattened into a simple good versus evil binary. The real focus isn't struggling honestly with historical injustice, but simply seeking to distance the present self from the identity of the past to claim moral superiority.
That's the coal smugness we talked about at the start. The feeling that I am better than my ancestors because I am standing here judging them from the future.
And that desire to fully escape the past through complete repudiation is profoundly naive, bordering on philosophical hubris. As James Baldwin argued so powerfully, history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history.
Wow. We are our history. You can't just unzip yourself from it.
You can't. Believing that any single generation can fully escape the foundational issues or psychological traits of the past is impossible. The course of history, the good and the bad lies in our bodies, our hearts, our minds, our habits, built upon the cumulative foundation of countless previous generations. What we criticize today in Jefferson's legacy is only visible to us because we are standing on the very ideals he articulated.
So we have to embrace the paradox. The American founding, for example, is suffused with the highest moral reasoning about liberty and equality, written by people who simultaneously held others in bondage.
The paradox is unavoidable. By definition, the more advanced the ideals and moral principles a society publicly adheres to, the greater the degree of hypocrisy it necessarily invites, because human beings are flawed. But those ideals, the language of equality, the concept of natural rights, are still what guided future progress.
Right.
If we reject the ideals because the individuals fail to perfectly execute them, we are rejecting the very tool future reformers like Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King Jr. used to expand justice. We are taking the latter away from the next generation.
So if the intellectual battle over history is fought between lionization and demonization, the physical battle for the monuments is often facilitated by established institutions, city councils, governments, and educational bodies. This raises the question of institutional complicity.
That's a huge piece of this. Historically, memory is rarely organic. It is often intentionally constructed by elites and political actors to serve national integration. This can be benign, creating a positive image of the state, or it can be highly manipulative.
Especially when constructing images of country competitors or political opponents.
Exactly. What some sources call the negatively significant other.
The idea of a negatively significant other is critical. You consolidate identity by defining yourself against an enemy, past or present.
And this is where it can cross into deliberate manipulation, what we now call information warfare. In an information conflict, historical memory can be revised and purposefully distorted by the state or powerful institutional actors. This causes profound spiritual shocks. It generates hatred of the past, breeds fear of the future, and, most effectively, blurs moral boundaries.
When institutions actively distort or rewrite history, they turn the citizen into a passive object of manipulation, rather than an active subject capable of critical thought.
That's it. When the government dictates who can be celebrated and who must be condemned, it usurps the citizen's role in engaging with their own history. This manipulation erodes public trust and fundamentally weakens the state's national security by shattering the cohesive shared story.
Because if your institutional masters keep telling you that everything you believed about your history is a lie,
you eventually stop trusting the institutions entirely.
Let's use the concrete institutional example we opened with. The removal of Thomas Jefferson from New York City Hall in November 2021. This was a unanimous vote by the Public Design Commission.
The stated rationale for that unanimous vote was the direct emotional discomfort expressed by a council member who stated she felt deeply uncomfortable in the presence of the statue, given Jefferson's slave ownership. And the institution, in that precise moment, chose capitulation to an immediate demand for comfort over its core educational mandate.
That's the betrayal, isn't it? The institution should be the guardian of complexity, teaching the public how Jefferson's words, the Declaration, became the tool for future liberation and equality movements, even if he couldn't live up to them himself.
Right.
But instead of context and challenging instruction, the immediate response is just erasure.
And this failure betrays the fundamental educational mission of history teaching. The purpose of historical education is to contribute to civil consolidation and the formation of a unified national identity, focusing on great people and the state's legitimate development. When institutions hide complexity or simply surrender to demands for an immediate, comfortable moral certitude, they treat the public like children who cannot handle the messy, tragic truth of the human story.
It's institutional failure of nerve. They are effectively saying, we cannot trust the public to reconcile two opposing truths, so we will eliminate one of the truths entirely.
And that just reinforces the sociological anomie we discussed earlier. If institutions are supposed to maintain semi-harmonious accommodation, but instead choose demolition and comfort, they are actively facilitating the societal derangement.
So if the goal is not to lionize or demonize, but to reach a mature historical consciousness, how do we take the true measure of these complex figures? We have to hold the good and the bad together without flattening either one.
Well, the presidential historian John Meacham suggested a necessary countermodel. We learn from ancestors not by gazing up at them uncritically or down on them condescendingly, but by looking them in the eye and taking their true measure as human beings, not as gods. We need to accept the tension inherent in great leadership.
The ultimate example of this difficult, intellectually mature appraisal comes from Frederick Douglass speaking about Abraham Lincoln in 1876 at the dedication of the Freedmen's Memorial. Douglass did not shy away from complexity at all.
His speech is a masterclass in nuanced historical appraisal. Douglass began by being absolutely unflinching about Lincoln's shortcomings. He said, "Abraham Lincoln was not our model. He was preeminently the white man's president."
Wow.
He pointed out that Lincoln was consistently ready and willing to, quote, deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity and the colored people during the early years of his administration for the sake of preserving the Union. He completely stripped away the lionization trap.
I mean, that's a brutal, honest accounting of the man's real-time, often cynical political calculations. But he didn't stop there.
No, he then shifts the focus from Lincoln the individual man to Lincoln the historical force acting under impossible pressures. He moved to a broad survey, measuring Lincoln not by isolated facts or stray utterances, but in the light of the stern logic of great events.
The stern logic of great events.
And Douglass concludes that despite all the mist and haze that surrounded him, he was ultimately the man of our redemption.
That requires immense intellectual and moral maturity. It frames the justice and liberty Lincoln ushered in, wrapped directly into the costly and tragic failings of the man and his era. It's an acknowledgement of tragedy, not a simple celebration of a saint.
That sober exploration of deep fractures and human sin, even against the highest ideals, is far more robust than either of the tracks we identified. It acknowledges that the man was flawed, but the trajectory he set under the pressure of those great events was ultimately redemptive. That trajectory is what the monument should honor.
And if we, as a generation, cannot achieve the intellectual maturity of a man born into slavery who had every right to total resentment, then what does that say about our current comfort?
It says we're prioritizing our own emotional comfort over historical honesty. We're prioritizing the momentary satisfaction of moral judgment over the long-term, hard-won progress that requires us to build upon flawed foundations. If we tear down the vessels of the ideals, how do we advance that higher concept of justice?
This necessary tension honoring a flawed legacy while striving for better fidelity to the ideals leads us directly into the philosophical antidote to this cultural self-hatred. And I think we have to start with G.K. Chesterton's famous defense of tradition, the democracy of the dead.
Chesterton provides the perfect rebuttal to the modern arrogance that assumes moral superiority simply by existing later in time. He reframes tradition not as some break on progress, but as an essential form of collective humility.
He viewed tradition not as stagnation, but as an extension of the franchise.
And he puts it so vividly. Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about.
The small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. That is the perfect encapsulation of the self-centered moralism we identified earlier. If you disqualify your ancestors from the conversation just because they are dead, that is the height of temporal snobbery. True humility requires us to listen to the wisdom of the past, even when that wisdom is delivered by imperfect people.
And this connection to the past is what the philosopher Roger Scruton spent his career defending, particularly through his concept of oikophilia. He coined this to stand in sharp contrast to the intellectual tendency he observed in modern elites, which he called oikomachia.
So, oikomachia, that's the act of fighting home. It's that educated derision, a sense of cultural sneering directed by academic or intellectual elites toward historical loyalties, local attachments, and patriotism, often dismissing them reflexively as xenophobia or simple bigotry.
Right. And oikophilia is the necessary positive counter. It is simply the love of the oikos, meaning not only the physical home, but the people contained in it and the surrounding settlements. It's the appreciation for the specific, inherited landscape and culture that gives that home lasting contours and an enduring smile.
The Jefferson removal, driven by the need for deep comfort, is arguably the purest modern example of institutional capitulation to that oikomachia, the rejection of a symbol that represents the foundational home.
It is, and oikophilia is not sentimentality. Scruton described it as a call to responsibility and a rebuke to calculation. It tells us to love, not just to use, to respect, not merely to exploit. This concept naturally leads to the conservation of the past, not out of blind nostalgia, but from a desire to live as an enduring consciousness among things that endure.
That's a beautiful phrase, living as an enduring consciousness among things that endure. It reframes the past not as dusty history, but as a living inheritance.
It connects you immediately to the contract between the generations. Scruton identified 5 key characteristics that define this loving attitude toward home: respect for the dead, the little platoons, the voice of tradition, aesthetic taste, the love of beauty and natural piety, a respect for the sacred.
Can we break down little platoons? It sounds abstract, but I suspect it's the most practical characteristic of oikophilia.
It is. It's the mechanism by which stability is maintained. When Scruton talks about little platoons, he's referring to the smaller, voluntary, face-to-face community organizations. The volunteer fire department, the local neighborhood watch, the church parish, the PTA, the local history society.
Okay, the building blocks of civil society.
Exactly. These are the institutions that provide immediate, tangible identity and build social cohesion. They are the structures that maintain synonymy. When those local bonds are strong, the individual is much more resistant to the generalized societal anomie.
If the national heroes are being dismantled by large, distant governments and institutions, the little platoons are the ones who can maintain local moral life and historical continuity.
Precisely. And when you see the cultural war waged against monuments or even against traditional forms of art and music, it is fundamentally a war against oikophilia itself, a generalized assault on all 5 characteristics of attachment to home.
And this leads to Scruton's most profound argument, that the destruction of these external symbols leads to an attack on the self. How does tearing down a statue impede the construction of the individual?
Well, Scruton argued that the final, ultimate end of every rational being is the building of the self. And this self-building is fundamentally synonymous with building, making, and decorating one's literal and figurative home. We achieve self-consciousness only by transforming the raw, chaotic materials of reality through language, culture, and material products like monuments and art into the living symbols of human intercourse.
So you see yourself reflected and anchored in the world around you. Your identity is literally materialized in your environment.
Yes. And if the world around you is constantly telling you that your ancestors were wicked, your symbols are corrupt, and your home is founded on sin, you cannot construct a stable, rooted, coherent self. When we destroy the symbols of home, when we tear down the figures that represent the foundational virtues and achievements of our people, we actively impede the construction of the self.
So it contributes directly to the widespread delusion of the self.
Yes, where the individual is rootless, floating, and susceptible to the generalized disorientation of sociological anomie.
That connects everything back to the beginning. The anomie isn't just an abstract sociological term. It's the sense of disorientation felt by a person whose collective memory has been systematically shattered. This is why Alasdair MacIntyre called for constructing local forms of community where moral life can be sustained during what he termed new dark ages.
And the creation of a cohesive community is contingent on having a shared story to draw from. Heroes are the vessels of that virtue. They embody courage, wisdom, and sacrifice, even if they were not saints.
So when you tear down Churchill, you're not just exposing a flaw, you are erasing the embodiment of defiance against tyranny. When you deconstruct historical figures, you lose the archetypes of courage, wisdom, and resilience that nourish the soul.
We need those specific, powerful narratives. Consider the anecdote of the 1683 siege of Vienna. The fate of Western civilization was arguably decided on that day. King Jan III Sobieski of Poland led that massive cavalry charge of the Polish winged hussars.
I know this story.
That charge, a massive, terrifying, psychologically dominant force, shattered the Ottoman lines and saved the city.
That is a historical moment that immediately becomes an archetype, a story that confirms survival, defiance, and collective purpose.
Exactly. That narrative confirms they belong to a grand contract between the dead, the living, and the yet-to-be-born. That sense of continuity and shared purpose is what oikophilia protects and what anomie destroys. The wisdom of the ancestors isn't about being blindly worshipped. It's about reminding the living what they are capable of when they act with collective, enduring purpose.
That's a powerful synthesis of our journey. The initial impulse to dismantle heroes, that psychological patricide, creates sociological disassociation, or anomie, which is characterized by the unfulfillable, insatiable will for moral purity.
Right.
And when established institutions like city halls betray their educational mission and capitulate to the demand for superficial comfort and erasure over context, the collective identity is profoundly eroded.
And the philosophical resilience required to counteract this is not to engage in the dualistic traps of lionization or demonization, but to adopt the posture of humility that Chesterton and Scruton advocated for. We must recognize the hubris inherent in judging the past, based solely on the present's self-centered moralism, which often ignores the complexities and pressures of the stern logic of great events.
Our job isn't to stand in the rubble, smugly judging those who built everything. Our job is to recognize ourselves, humbly, as dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. The only reason we can see as far as we do, the only reason we can articulate the need for greater justice is because of the moral and structural height that those complex, flawed figures gave us.
And progress comes not from rejecting the past entirely and starting from zero, which is the path to anomie. Rather, it comes from demanding a closer fidelity to the enduring ideals that the founders put forth, even if they fail to live up to them. The highest devotion we can give is not to our society as it is, but to a concept of what we would like it to be. The only way to achieve that higher concept is by acknowledging, studying, and building upon the flawed, yet enduring, living legacy we have inherited.